I'm Anne Majette, the former classical music critic of the Washington Post, welcoming you to Fall for the Book 2020, a virtual series of free online events running through November. You can find the full schedule at fallforthebook.org. That's all one word, fall from the book, fall for the book. And you can follow along on Crowdcast. Just go to the Fall for the Book icon above this window and click follow. And as you listen to this conversation, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat window on your screen. We will leave time for Q&A at the end of this discussion. It is my huge pleasure to be talking today to Philip Kennicott, my former colleague at the Washington Post and still my good friend and inspiration. At the Post, Philip currently wears the hat of senior art and architecture critic, although he takes on virtually everything, particularly everything visual that has relevance to our culture and society. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and has published in numerous publications. Don't miss his piece, Smuggler, in the Virginia Quarterly, which was named one of the best American essays a couple of years ago. Philip, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Anne, and thanks to Fall for the Book for including us in their lineup this season.
So it's been wonderful to revisit Counterpoint again, which is called A Memoir of Bach and Mourning, tapping right in the title into our idea that classical music is well suited to our expressions of deep emotion, particularly kind of grief and nostalgia. I think you intended originally to write a book that was focused more on the Goldberg Variations, and it gradually morphed into a memoir about the Goldberg Variations. How did you experience that shift, or do you see it as a shift or just a natural evolution?
It was a bit of both. You know, I got some good early feedback when I started writing. I had initially intended to write, as you say, a book about Bach. And it began with my mother's death in a moment when I was listening to a very, particular Bach piece and was kind of obsessed with it. And I thought I'd start there and then talk mainly about Bach. So I wrote a first chapter, and my editor at the time, John Glissman at Norton, read it. And luckily, he is a music lover, so he was susceptible to the Bach parts. But he also thought that the parts that I included about my mother's death were a way of kind of creating a broader avenue, I think, for the reader. And I might have resisted that a little bit at the beginning because I'm not a big sort of let it all hang out there sort of guy. Memoir is not what I think of as my natural mode of expression. But I found actually once I started doing it that it was therapeutic, and it actually led to some interesting insights into music as well. So in a way, it happened organically after a little bit of prodding at the beginning.
You interweave your own life beautifully and your family life with the story of Bach's life, the sort of parallels of education and interrelations with other people. Did this project bring you to a new understanding of Bach? Did you do a lot of research on Bach? Were you mainly sort of recognizing parallels of things you had long known? And how did it sort of change your view of Bach coming out of it?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I kind of came of age during a period when it was fashionable to not be interested in the lives of creators. It was the work that mattered, right? Who cares what Shakespeare's life was? Who cares what Michelangelo's life was? Who cares what Bach's life was? And when I was first listening and reading and trying to make sense of Bach's music as a musician, I didn't actually look much into his life. And it really took some deeper reading into it. Christoph Wolff's wonderful biography and another book by John Eliot Gardner, to realize that he is a human being and he had an extraordinarily difficult life, a very painful early life in particular. He was orphaned at a young age and really was out there kind of on his own, having to make a living from before an age at which most of us are still in high school. And I wrestled with that because all of my training was to sort of, be interested, but set that aside. That's not relevant to the music. I think ultimately what I realized is that it actually is relevant to music. I can't say how precisely, no one could ever point to a biographical detail and say, okay, that's why he did this in a particular work. But I think we can look at the aggregate of his life and realize that there are reflections and connections in there.
Sure. And without falling prey to the fallacy that Mozart wrote a slow movement and that means he was sad, which is not exactly what is meant.
And that was so part of how we all learned music growing up, probably around the same time, and understanding the same sort of same sort of resistance to those things.
Right, right. Well, you write very poignantly in the book about your own childhood, including darker moments in that. And there's a passage when you're in a conflict with your mother and come to this sort of crystallization of a decision that you want to live, in effect, a life of the mind, that you're only going to focus on what's important and leave aside the non-essentials. And it seems to me a very telling, illustration of how you've lived your life since. And in a way, the memoir is opening up the personal as well as the intellectual and getting you back into, as you say, the personal details of Bach's life, but also the personal details of your own, which are things that I think in our generation, exactly, we were told weren't as important. Now that you're merging the two, does it lead you to write differently? Has it changed your own view of what is important? Do you see the memoir genre differently than you did?
That question actually gets at the heart of a lot of what I've been thinking about recently. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, there was this moment that you referred to when I was young, and it was kind of a watershed moment in my life. I was 14 or 15 years old, and I sort of realized that my mother, who was a difficult person, an unhappy person, that I wasn't going to be able to rely on her in the way that children usually rely on their parents. And I decided to sort of create my own world, and it was a world of books and music and art, and that was very sustaining for a long time. I think that the lesson I learned from writing this memoir is that that was the decision of a 14-year-old, and it's not necessarily a sustainable life through the whole arc of one's life. And now in some ways I feel like I'm unlearning that very thing that was so important to my emotional survival at that age. I'm probably more touchy-feely at the age of 54 than I was at the age of 15 or 16 right now. And I'm looking at memoir. I was uncomfortable writing a memoir. I was uncomfortable having it out there. And now when I think about my next project, it's another memoir. So it's helped me really kind of, I don't know, accept the usage of the first person. And the nice thing about that is that it actually it's a way of attracting readers. The sort of hard, abstract historical view that I originally was going to take, that never would have worked. I think it actually works much better the way I ended up in finally doing it.
Yeah. Well, it would have worked, but it would have been a university press kind of book instead of the kind of book it is. It's interesting because throughout the book, you also have a lot of parallels between music and people. You talk about the sins you commit against music or the sins you commit against people, and you talk about very tellingly and pithily what it means to know a piece of music or a person. And you explore that quite a bit and write that simply being a bystander to a piece isn't as satisfying. And that really struck with me because I think for many people who love classical music, they still have a sense of being a bystander, like understanding how to connect with this music beyond simply sort of holding yourself against the piece and loving it a lot. Is a challenging thing in this field, as it is not for books and for movies where people participate with a lot more involvement. I wondered about your thoughts of that, both about knowing a piece of music, but sort of how can you know a piece of music beyond simply standing near it and loving it without perhaps actually having to play it yourself?
Yeah, that was the question that was really the starting place for me when I was thinking of this mainly as a book about music. And you're right. What does it mean to know a piece of music? And I think a lot of people who listen to classical music, and I think classical music even more than other kinds of music, because there is this superstructure of ideology built around it. There's always this fear that you're not quite getting it, right? That you want to somehow get deeper into it. And uh, what I wanted to sort of explore was that even if you can play the piano, and even if you can maybe even play the Goldberg Variations, or play them by memory, or even play them by memory in front of an audience, that feeling never goes away. And it has something to do with our own incapacity to kind of ever completely be absorbed into something, an aesthetic object. It's also true in a way of people, I tried to explore. There's something deeply unsatisfied about our most intense relationships, and I think that's what gives them that intensity. So I would like, if nothing else, if a reader came to this book and is not particularly musical, but interested in music, maybe enjoys hearing Bach from time to time, to come away with an understanding that, you know what, you may feel at the end of that fugue that you didn't quite get it, but everybody feels that way. Even people who might be able to sit down and write a fugue, I think at the end are always going to feel as if there's something left still to be processed, still to be taken in.
That's it's a telling metaphor for all of art, because art is something that we have renewed conversations with. You know, the same work of art is something that we can revisit many times through our lives and has different things to tell us along the way. Um, but it's curious to me that classical music has that reserve, particularly more so than a painting, where I think you can come away from a painting with a deeper sense of connection on a first viewing, even if you were not well trained in painting. But somehow we believe that to understand classical music, you have to be some sort of acolyte. Would you agree with that, actually?
Yeah, I might say that looking at an abstract painting will sometimes give people a similar feeling that people have with classical music. You know, when you look at a painting, you look at a Monet or something like that, and you know, oh, that's a bridge over a lily pond. That's lovely. You may not understand, or you may not feel confident talking about why he painted that particular way, but the content is direct and it's immediate, and you can appropriate it in a way. And you can talk to somebody about that. You know, you can stand in front of that and say, well, look how he painted that bridge. Isn't that pond very beautiful? But when you're standing in front of a purely abstract painting, some of that same nervousness comes, right? You're thinking, well, am I getting it? What's going on here? Have I gotten to the core of this? I think that parallel actually is very strong with classical music, and maybe less so with popular music, where you know there are lyrics and there's a thing you do to it. You dance or you move. You know, there's a set of societally sanctioned ways of engaging with aesthetic objects that are somehow more fraught for some reason with classical music than other kinds of art.
Sure, sure. Maybe a parallel is, you know, free jazz or something, where there's also a,
Yeah.
a sill, shall we say, a threshold.
Yeah, I mean that I have to say that I find myself in that same uncertain, am I getting this? What's wrong with me when I hear certain kinds of free jazz?
Me too. That's why I thought of it. As for the Goldberg variations, it's interesting that when you open your memoir, you're talking about Bach's Chaconne and not the Goldberg variations, but yet it's the Goldberg variations you learn, and you explain why that is. But the Goldberg variations, Bach in general, but the Goldbergs in particular, seem to be having a kind of extended cultural moment in the last couple of decades or so, where they've become sort of talismans. We've heard them transcribed for every possible instrument, from marimba to most recently harp. Parker Ramsey brought out a harp Goldberg variations this fall. It's quite wonderful. And I also think of the pianist Simona Dinnerstein, who learned the Goldbergs to commemorate her pregnancy and the birth of her son, also a life milestone, which then launched her piano career. What is it about the Goldbergs in particular? It's something you talk about a little bit in the book. And can you talk about why you picked the Goldbergs and not Art of Fugue or something else?
I think I was susceptible to that same kind of cultural resonance that's been there, you know. Yeah. Glenn Gould obviously is the great figure that establishes this piece, and you know, some in the 1950s he records them, and so for people of my parents' generation and mentors and college professors, this piece was the great piece. I mean, this is the one you poured yourself a little snifter of brandy and you turned the lights low and you put the LP on the stereo and you listened intently to this piece. I remember, you know, I did that too, and thinking, wow, this is one of these sacred objects, and it's continued to have that status, sometimes almost comically inflected. I mean, what is it that Hannibal Lecter listens to in Silence of the Lambs? Oh, it's the Goldberg variation. So it becomes kind of a, you know, a sign of the overactive intelligence or something. I think, however, that it remains with us, and you see a younger generation like Parker Ramsey and Pavel Kolesnikov, this wonderful pianist who's just recorded them. People come back to it because it's got so much in it. And it's a piece that, you know, because it plays out in variations, there are 30 of these variations, they run this amazing range. I mean, some of them are pop song accessible. They're just fun little playing around with the bass line and you know, a jig melody on top. Others are just as profound and despairing and intensely chromatic as anything Bach writes. So the range of them is great. I think the range is probably greater than Art of the Fugue, which, you know, I love it, but it's an abstract work. It's a really hard work to wrestle with, because Bach lets himself use different types of you know, musical forms. The range is bigger. You know, he writes a little fugue. He writes 9 canons. He writes essentially arias, you know, melodic lines over just basically strummed left hand figures. I mean, it's all there. And I don't know the particulars of Simone Dinnerstein's relationship when she was pregnant, but it's the sort of piece that can sustain you over a long period of difficulty, struggle, growth, because you can keep going back to it.
Right, right. Although, is that more true than, say, the Beethoven sonatas? I mean, that's an extreme example because it's many hours of music, but there are a lot of cycles. We are thinking more cyclically these days. I think that 50 years ago, people didn't go and sit to hear cycles the same way that we do now.
Yeah, that's true, and it probably has something to do with the audience for classical music maybe getting smaller and more intense in some ways. You know, it's the broad, big audience of a century ago or 75 years ago that included people who, you know, were really, really focused on classical music, but also people who on a Sunday afternoon thought it'd be nice to go out and hear some light orchestral works. That
Right.
audience is kind of gone. And alas, we're down to the sort of hardcores in a lot of ways. And I think hardcore people tend to want to kind of know things completely. That said, it's interesting, you know, that when Bach wrote these variations, we don't actually know whether he ever intended people to play them through. There's some clues that he thought of them as a coherent whole, but very likely somebody who would have played these variations in the 1750s would probably have just picked a few that they liked and arranged them into an order that seemed satisfying to them and then intermixed them with other things. We don't actually know.
Sure. Well, you'd be leafing on your piano through your sheet music. What will I play now? And you'd pick out number 15 or whatever it is. But
Right, you know, 8 or 9 pieces in G major or something close by. So
exactly. As you sipped your mead. When you evoked that image, though, of sitting down when dimming the lights and really taking it on, I thought that's a very late 20th century picture of consuming music. One of the shifts we've seen, Lydia Gür, the philosopher, writes about this very pithily, the difference between music as an activity, which it originally was, and music as a sort of sacred object. And it seems to me that in your book, you're sort of taking the sacred object and turning it into an activity. And that one of the reasons we're more distanced from it is because of this sort of canonization of it. Are you generally in favor of that? I mean, as somebody who's very in love with the tradition of Western art and Western music, there is a certain amount of respect for the canon and admiration for the canon. Do you think we should be trying to take it down? And do you think that we should be dimming the lights to listen to the Goldbergs, or that we should have them on while we're working out at the gym, or if there are any shoulds at all?
I don't think there are any shoulds. I have to confess that I still live with a mindset of great works. I mean, I will argue long into the evening that the Goldberg Variations are a really great work. They're even a masterpiece. And people are uncomfortable, increasingly uncomfortable with that word because of exactly the sort of things you're saying. The way I look at it is that they're a masterpiece because of their breadth and because of their openness. You can listen to them, as you say, on headphones, running in the park. You can also do that kind of, very focused thing where you sit down, you listen intently, maybe you even flip through the score. They satisfy both. And I think it's great no matter how people listen to them. That said, I still think that there is a canon of great works which needs to be expanded, but I have no discomfort saying that those are great works, especially a piece like the Goldberg Variations.
Sure. And of course, the Goldbergs isn't as overdone as Beethoven's Fifth, which is also a great work, but perhaps not worth being played, every single season by every single orchestra.
Yeah, it's true. And you asked about earlier, like, why didn't I focus on the Beethoven sonatas? In some ways, it had to do with that slightly more exhaustible quality that Beethoven has. I mean, he gets you by the lapels and he shakes you and he really gives you his message. And that's great. I mean, it's wonderful. But after an hour or two of that, I need something else. And
Right.
Bach never does that. He's going to talk in a very measured way. He's going to say profound, beautiful, powerful, anguished things, but he's never going to raise his voice at you in that same way that Beethoven seems to.
Yeah, yeah. He's a better dinner companion. This isn't the first book in the memoir genre, if you will, of adult relearns a masterpiece or learns a masterpiece and seeks to perform it. and the sort of trope would be for it to culminate in a performance. You write a lot about performing, the pitfalls of performing. There has yet to be a Philip Kennicott plays the Goldbergs at the Kennedy Center moment. And you write, there never will be. you write also about stage fright and about the challenges, particularly as a non-professional, doing this kind of thing, which is another memoir. There was a memoir recently called Playing Scared by Sarah Solovich about stage fright and dealing with it. So why do you say there will never be that performance? And what were your feelings about playing the piece since you were spending the whole time learning it?
I think I came to realize fairly early on that this wasn't going to have the Hollywood ending, right? It's not gonna be me triumphantly mastering my fears and insecurities and having successfully grappled with the grief over my mother's death. I go out and I play the Goldberg Variations and everybody claps and proclaims it a miracle. I'd love it if that could happen, but for me, the anxiety of playing in front of people is so profound and crippling that I don't need to beat myself again and again and again to try and overcome it. If someone gave me a pill and somehow it went away and I could do it, that would be great. But I've come to accept the fact that for me, music making is a private thing. It's something that I like to share with people I'm very comfortable with, and even then, I still get a little nervous. It doesn't have to be out there. That said, I participated in a book talk about the Goldberg Variations recently, and I wanted to demonstrate a particular thing. Bach does these things where he has the hands crossing on the keyboard, and I was trying to demonstrate that to people who would be, joining the Zoom talk. And so I volunteered that I would sit down at my piano and have my partner's cell phone record me doing just a couple measures of that. Even with nobody in the room but completely trusted loved ones and just a cell phone camera, I had to, go through the breathing exercises, lie down, stare at the ceiling. Stage fright and I think, will always be, completely intertwined. I'm never going to overcome that one.
Have we ruined ourselves by being critics as well? I tried to do a video earlier this spring and I simply wanted 2 notes. And I think I did 45 takes to get 2 notes sung, which is my instrument. Has being a critic, changed the way you perceive music or made the stage fright harder, or is that a separate thing?
So I don't think I could have written this book back when I was still doing criticism as a daily job, or at least music criticism. I was a classical music critic, as you know, for a long time, and then I stopped doing that and started writing about other things. And stopping the daily criticism of music was absolutely essential for me to get back to making music myself. That critical thing that's always going on in the back of the head, especially if you're, as you well know, as somebody who's written on, an hour deadline after hearing a concert, you're always processing at a remove. And I needed to get that. I need to stop that. I still write about music sometimes, but it's mainly about recordings or about the music itself, not about the performance of other people. And I'm really glad that I did that, because writing this book and learning the piece, I really did put some serious energy into learning this piece, just reminded me of the incredible complexity of what a good musician, a great musician is doing when they're playing even a simple piece in front of people. I'm just stunned by the tens of thousands of decisions that go into what may sound like just a simple little aria that lasts a minute.
Yeah. Yes, and being a critic, of course, you constantly have to sit in judgment effectively, or at least weigh in some way on these performances, and it does sort of inure you. And also you get used to hearing the top 0.5% of great performances in terms of what your benchmark is. You get a very unrealistic view, I think.
I know. and to say that this performance of Near Genius is 4% less good than this performance of almost, I would much rather be a listener, and have my thoughts and feelings. And I walk out of concerts and think, that wasn't the best I've heard. But I don't want to be in the business of having to sort of put that on the record in the same way that a classical music critic, especially of an earlier generation, were doing. Kind of when we were young critics, that was the model.
Sure. Well, as somebody who quit a job a year ago for some of these exact same reasons, I feel what you're saying very much. But speaking of recordings, what recordings of the Goldbergs do you return to? I mean, Glenn Gould remains the benchmark for everybody. Are there other recordings? You mentioned a couple, but are there some you found touchstones? And also, what do you feel about the transcriptions for other instruments? Are they more stunts? Are they musically as effective? What are your thoughts?
So many thoughts. And, I don't actually listen to recordings of Goldberg very often. The Gould recordings, especially the first one from the 50s, that to me is a benchmark. I go back to that fairly often. Um, I've been interested recently to see some younger artists take up. I mentioned, well, you mentioned Parker Ramsey. He's a harpist who's transcribed it. And I find that a really fascinating performance. Part of me would think, okay, how do you possibly do this in the harp? Because the harp, because of technical things about how harps work and function, is is just adding layers of complexity into how you get that music out. I mean, the harp wasn't made to do those sorts of things. But I think by virtue of mastering the harp, playing that, he finds other things in the piece that a harpsichordist wouldn't find or a pianist wouldn't find. There are places, especially in the 25th variation, very chromatic variation, very slow moving, constant moving by half steps. The harp in that is a revelation because it's all kind of bleeding through and it becomes almost a kind of impressionist take on the variation. As I mentioned, the young pianist Pavel Klistnikov, wonderful performance, but so intimate, so gentle. It's almost as if he's decided that like all of the weight of the greatness of the Goldberg variations, he's just put that aside. I'm gonna find a small, interesting, delicate way through this on my own. It's really lovely. Others, I mean, Vladimir Feldsman's performance is really fascinating because he's a pianist who takes seriously the permission that Baroque gives you, Baroque music, to ornament and kind of recreate the music, and he does that, just all over the place. It's kind of fascinating. And then I like Andras Schiff a great deal as well because I think he kind of he finds the middle course between, a very sort of scholarly and a much more free pianistic version of it.
The ornament, of course, is an interesting thing because Baroque music would have been ornamented to a degree that we can't even process today, where we're so true to the text and everything we hear. And that's a whole different skill in a way than learning to just play the notes, and not one that we're encouraged to learn. You don't do much of that, do you?
I try to do a little bit of it. So in a Baroque piece, for people who may not necessarily know this as music lovers, commonplace in a Baroque piece is you would play the first half of the piece and then you repeat it. And on the second repeat, especially in Bach, you'd give yourself some freedom. You'd rewrite things a little bit. You'd add in trills and flourishes and maybe even sculpt the melody line a little bit different. We don't exactly know what the full parameters of that permission was, but it was a way of kind of putting your stamp onto the music. The problem is that those little flourishes, especially ornaments, trills, mordents, these kinds of things, they're a little more difficult, I think, on the piano than they were on the harpsichord, where the action was a little different. So for me, it's very challenging. I mean, really good pianists don't have any problems doing this, but for me, I have to kind of calculate every little detail that I add if I'm going to ornament the second time around. And so when I think about the Goldberg Variations, maybe by 2027, I will be able to play them without the ornaments. And if I live to 2060, maybe I'll be able to play them with the ornaments.
It's good to have a goal.
I should get into 2060 would be the main goal.
Being able to play at that age would be very impressive. People do. Menachem Pressler. I have a couple more questions, but we're also getting some questions in from the audience. So I think I'll start introducing a few of those. One audience member writes, thank you for daring to share this deeply personal journey. Was the writing itself a journey of self-discovery or more a chronicle of something that had recently happened to you that you just needed to sit down and write? Throughout the book, you make connections between Bach and your mother or between music and grief, for example, and I wonder whether you were surprised by the connections you found during the writing process. Did you use a personal journal as a basis for the book? That's actually something I wondered too, because there were so many beautiful moments of resonance between Bach and his mother and the dog losing his mother. And that one stuck in my head particularly.
Mainly I worked the book out in the writing of it. I did keep online. I had a place where when I thought of something, I would go and I would put it down. but that was mainly to keep from forgetting things. And I threw out probably 80% of those things that I thought might eventually make it into the book. Um, but the question does get at the process. It's a bit of both. I mean, from when my mother died, I didn't intend to write a book, but I did write something because I had to write something for a magazine column I used to do for Gramophone, and I was on deadline. My mom had just died, and I didn't have anything else to say, so I wrote about the Bach Chaconne, and people who read that said that they liked that column more than anything else I'd written, and that made me think, okay, well maybe there's something here. So in the beginning, it was processing the immediate stuff, but as I got to farther and deeper into the project, it really was about resurrecting memory and sorting through things. And I had not expected that process to be nearly as therapeutic as it became. I mean, I do think that in the process of getting this down, I came to understand who my mother was and have a great deal more empathy for her than I did even at the time when she was sick and going through her last days.
Mm. And that was through your writing, less than through Bach. Yes. What is interesting is that the project of learning a piece for her became the project of writing a book about her, different kind of memorial.
Yeah, and a book that I could never have written while she was alive.
Right.
When you're writing about a parent who was a difficult person, it has to be done well. For me, it had to be done after a point at which she wouldn't read the book.
What was your family's reaction to the book?
So I sent the manuscript off to one of my sisters who has a good ear for kind of the family reaction, and she said, this is okay. My dad actually died before reading the book. The book came out in the end of February, and he died, we think, probably of COVID-19 at the end of March, and he never read it. Now this sounds odd, but I'm not exactly unhappy about that. I was worried about my dad's take on it because he was invested in happier memories of our family than I think his children retained. And I didn't necessarily want to disabuse him of those feelings, when he was in his mid 80s. In some ways, those chapters were closed as family chapters, if they were still open for me as a personal chapter.
Right. I didn't realize he hadn't read it. Yeah. And of course, that's a curveball that life threw you, to be dealing with the death of another parent when you can't just go out and write another book about that. Or take on the Goldberg Variations or something.
The funny thing is, there was one thing that I wrote in the book that a lot of people took exception to, and in a couple places actually in print, and that is that I didn't find music consoling. And I have a whole explanation for that, which I won't go into, but it mainly has to do with the fact that I consider music to be more than consoling, more than just a kind of therapy pill that we give ourselves when we're unhappy. But after my father died, I pulled out the Goldberg Variations and started playing them again, and I'll confess that I found them a little bit consoling.
I think we need a correction.
I'm not going to correct it, no.
All right, here's another audience question. Regarding the knowability or otherwise of a piece of music, is a great work axiomatically one we never quite feel we can know? And as a follow-up, say a manuscript appeared in which Bach said what the Goldbergs were about, how they were to be played, whether or not they were to be played straight through. Would such definitive knowledge affect the depth of their greatness, or is it safely baked into the music?
So two questions there. I think the question about a manuscript is a fascinating hypothetical. So yes, what if Bach sent us a letter from beyond the grave that said the Goldberg Variations are about this is the tempo, all of that. I don't think that would affect it at all. It's not the ambiguity in music that I think necessarily makes it great. It's the inexhaustibility, the ability to keep going back and reinterpreting and rethinking. And I don't think that would change even with precise directions about it. I mean, there's a famous case of Beethoven's metronome markings, which have haunted people for years and years. He left some metronome markings, but do we take them seriously? Was his metronome accurate? Was he right about his own music? We might know it better than he did. I know that sounds like sacrilege, but it's true that the author isn't the final owner of a piece of music, especially a great piece of music. That falls to the interpreters. And I see no reason to hamstring them in any way, including the author's own directives about how it's to be done.
Well, isn't that true of any work of art or anything that you put out in the public sphere? As a critic, certainly, we all know that people can radically interpret in radically different ways the same piece of writing that you put out there. You'll get readers excoriating you and praising you for the same thing, often based on misunderstandings in both cases. And,
Yes, and it's making me wonder about all those times I've sent them emails saying, no, no, you've misread me.
right, exactly. And there's Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings, which was meant to be an expression of fecundity and spring awakening, and we take as our sort of national anthem of mourning now in countless movies. It's hard to say what music is about. That's a whole other question, isn't it?
Yeah. No.
Um, and somebody else asks, a memoir is a work of art as much as a symphony or a building. What did or do you bring to the craft of writing from your study of music and architecture? Were you conscious of that interplay? I guess this is also a question about the critic-creator divide. And I would also add to that question, how has writing a memoir changed your writing in general, if at all, since you wrote the memoir?
You know, because it was a book and because it was a subject that meant a great deal to me, I felt that I wanted to craft this more than I had the time to craft things that I write for a daily newspaper. I mean, I would like those to be crafted, but at some point you simply have to, you simply have to send it out into the world and let your editor make some changes and it gets to the reader. This, I had a longer period of time, and I did think about things like structure, and in some ways there's a sort of secret relationship to the Goldberg Variations that I tried to build in, mainly for my own sense of homage in a way. For me, I wanted the book to get the tone right. I wanted to share with readers something that I care about deeply. I also wanted to talk about my own family, but to do it in a way that didn't feel exploitative, manipulative. I wanted to be as sort of straightforward and honest. And in a way, that notion of being honest, I think, is probably the point at which a memoir intersects with the idea of art the most. It is the rigor of the honesty that you have to be attentive to. And that, if you get it right, hopefully elevates it beyond just a set of memories.
Right, right. That's sort of tangential. Something else I wanted to ask. There's an image in the book of your mother listening from other parts of the house when you're practicing, which ties into, stage fright and expectation of who's listening to you. And, we're aware of that as writers as well. And I wondered how does the listening voice in your head when you're making music relate to the audience in your head when you're writing a memoir, relating to the audience in your head when you're writing a newspaper article? Is it all sort of the same fictive audience, or do you develop different audiences for different kinds of things you're doing?
I never thought about that.
Really?
Well, so, I mean, I guess the answer I would give first is that with music, music for me is very bound up with the idea of the erotic in the broad sense, the desire for love, the hope of like bringing people in a big hug towards me. I don't feel that way when I write. When I write, I don't really think of the audience much. I think more of just trying to get the words as clear and as powerful as I can get them. And I take the audience a bit more for granted. The audience always feels much more immediate for me. Even if I'm alone in a room playing the music just for myself, there is this, I don't know, this unfinished, incomplete aspect of the soul that the music seems to be expressing, and it wants to find its it wants to find its other, its companion, its ideal finishing person out there. I think that famous story, Aristophanes' story from Plato, in which he imagines human beings actually divided into two pieces, and you spend your life hunting through the world for that thing that completes your half. In some ways, that's what I feel like when I'm making music.
Sure. And music's happening in real time too, where writing is being written considerably after the fact of writing, which is a buffer for the writer as well.
That's true. No, that's true. And when you write something, especially a book, I finished this, I don't know, 2.5 years ago, and then it just sits and it goes through this process, and then it has to be printed, and so the immediacy of writing is so much different.
Yeah, Absolutely. It's not like you're extemporizing or giving a lecture, for example, when you might be riffing a little bit more. Another audience question is, has the audience for your book, which I greatly enjoyed, been mostly serious listeners to classical music, amateur or professional performers, or those interested in memoir? Which is an interesting question. And I wonder if you as an author even know that, because we can't control exactly what those Amazon numbers are telling us in terms of who's actually making the clicks.
Yeah, you're right. I don't know the answer to that. I've heard from all sorts of people, but mainly the people I've heard from have been people like me who are amateur musicians who, grew up playing an instrument and had to make their peace with not being great at it. And that's a very painful thing. Anybody who's gone through that will immediately, I think, understand some of what I'm writing about in some of the chapters of this book. And I've heard from people from all over the country and even the world who went through that. And then the other people that I've heard from were people who had a relationship with a parent or a family member that was similar to the one that I had with my mother, and who understand the kind of the uncompletedness of one's emotional life if you have a parent who is problematic or unavailable in some way. I have heard from musicians, and I'm very gratified when I hear from a serious musician, mainly because the thing that I was most anxious about was the musicians writing me notes saying, well, nice book, but you totally define what a canon is wrong, or you put that in the wrong key, or what you don't know about harpsichords. That's what I was worried about. Fortunately, I don't feel like I've gotten a lot of that, which is gratifying.
Especially in classical music, where there are people out there who know the work so intimately that they're waiting to jump on you about your dotted rhythms or whatever.
Exactly. About every detail, which is great.
Yeah. I had another question about you touch about on childhood piano lessons and the whole experience of teaching and being taught piano. And you say a little bit about the ubiquity of childhood piano lessons. It made me just think about piano as a cultural object in our society drifting away. It's gone by the wayside a little bit. We had a colleague at the Post in the last year or so writing about how people were having trouble getting rid of their pianos, that nobody wants pianos, they're just getting junked. And is our relationship to this music changing as we move away from this opportunity of doing it ourselves? I think fewer and fewer of people reading this book are going to be able to sit down and play the Goldberg themselves as you could.
Yeah, it clearly has changed. I mean, just the number of pianos that are being bought today this has gone down. The real kind of high tide of this was in the middle of the last century, and lots of homes, especially homes in kind of rising middle class families, had pianos. It was seen both as something that kids should do to kind of improve their understanding of the world and their status and so on. But it was also a social activity. You at Christmas, you stood around the piano and you sang Christmas carols. I used to do that. I used to have a party every Christmas, invite friends over, and I kind of whittled that down to a core of close friends recently, because I started noticing that a lot of people just didn't know the carols anymore, which was surprising to me. I find that sad, but people will get music somehow, right? If it's not in that form, they will find other ways to get it. I hope at some point there's a revival. Maybe it'll be a kind of steampunk revival of pianos or something, because it is such a wonderful instrument, and it is, again, a social instrument. I mean, you can play with a second person, two people playing four-hand Mozart sonatas. What a great way to spend an evening! But then also playing with somebody who's playing another instrument, or singing, or just having these songs in common. I hope we don't entirely lose that socially.
It's what you say dovetails with somebody's observation that they just raised, that the COVID pandemic has been a catalyst for a lot of things, and it's also sort of devastated the music field. But it would be a great time to take up the piano, play the piano, practice the piano. This particular audience member observes that he or she is a classical singer who can now not do the thing that they do because of the pandemic. And the observations in your book about being afraid to pick up the Goldbergs and actively avoiding it really resonated right now, that this person has not wanted to sing or listen to anything because of that fear of vulnerability, and that many colleagues are feeling the same, that this time is really changing our relationship to music in a lot of ways. Are you finding that this is a time when you were able to practice more? The obvious obstacle being your dog, who does not like you to practice at all.
I am playing more, and it's interesting because my COVID failure is I can't read. I'm having a really hard time reading long books, which used to be a regular part of my life. But I am finding I have the mental energy to play the piano. I have no idea why that is. But for the participant who's the singer, oh, I sure hope that he or she is making music. I mean, I have been tuning in to online performances. I never thought I would do it. I thought in the beginning of the pandemic, nobody's going to want to listen to music this way. I listen to a lot of music that way, and I'm grateful for everybody who puts it out there. And I had an experience very early on in the pandemic when I was watching a really great pianist, the sort of pianist who you would have to fight to get a Carnegie Hall ticket to play. And he was playing in this little living room beautifully, but the sound was tinny. And I was so moved by it. Just the thought of this enormous need for connection and expression being contained in this space without an audience. I don't know. I was almost in tears listening to him play the music for something about the persistence of that talent and expression and the tragedy of it not having an audience at the moment.
Yeah, or a virtual audience. I would add, though, that I think no musician should beat him or herself up about not broadcasting music right now. This pandemic has hit people in so many different ways, and some people have found it a complete muffling of the creative voice. And as painful as that is, you have to give yourself self-love about it.
Absolutely. I mean, what I found over and over again during the pandemic is the unpredictability of our emotional responses to it and our adaptations to it. And I'm doing things differently in relationship to the pandemic than I was in March or April. There is no one way to get through things.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, we don't seem to have any more questions. I was curious. I asked you a little bit before, but I don't think you quite answered it. Maybe it's a way to wrap up. Do you feel that you're different as a writer now? Do you feel you're addressing your newspaper writing differently? And I do ask that because I feel like I'm seeing a little more memoir in your newspaper articles lately, that there's more of you in there, and what your thoughts are, if you agree.
Well, thanks for reading enough to actually be alert to that, because it's true. For the first 30 years of my career, 25, 30 years of my career, I really resisted the first person because I felt like the reader, they don't need to know what I had for lunch or whether I was feeling up or down or baffled by this or that. It felt to me that the job of the critic was to process things in a fairly abstract but clear way for the reader, not to sort of have them sit down next to you and enjoy an intimate conversation. Readers have changed a lot, and newspapers have changed a lot, and then I've changed, and the book actually had a lot to do with that change. I am much more comfortable with the first person than I was before, and I've taken what feel to me like risks of self-exposure in print much more than I would have 5 or 10 years ago. And the only reason that I keep doing that is that I find that it actually has been well received, and that I think in some ways, we as newspaper journalists, we know how many people are reading every story we write, and the stories that have had a first person element have been far more successful, have reached a far wider audience than really any of the other kinds of stories that I've written. And so I think the evidence is in that idea of what great criticism should be circa 1985 is not what it is in 2020.
Right. Well, for criticism, we have to do more of a sales job anyway. It's not, people don't quite understand it or take it for granted, but that's a whole nother topic. So what is your next book, Philip? Can you talk about that, or as a closing lagniappe?
I am working again on another memoir, and it's focused on a particular period of my life in school that raises the question, why does junior high school have to be so damn miserable for people? Now, that said, I am only about 6,000, 7,000 words into a proposal, but I think there might be something there, and I'm going to try and see if I can interest people in that.
Are you working with the same team, or do you not know that yet?
I don't know that yet. At this point, it's I'm trying to prepare a proposal and see what my team thinks of it.
Great, great. Well, this has been a pleasure for
One,
me.
oh,
And, oh, I'm sorry, you were going to say one more thing?
yes, before we go, I just wanted to ask you about your book.
About my book.
Yeah.
Well, I quit my job to work on my book, echoing many of the things Philip said. I'm writing a book about the woman who built Beethoven's pianos, which is actually a way to put women back into the picture of classical music, since what I've discovered is it's not so much that the woman who built Beethoven's pianos was unusual, as that we've just written women out of our history. And the picture of the classical music world, when we put the women back in it, is so much different and quirkier and more interesting to me that it's really a great pleasure to be working on this.
This is
But
going to
stay
be
tuned, it's going to take a while.
good.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much to Fall for the Book. If you're interested in buying the book, everybody can click the button at the bottom of the screen. There's a nice, I forget if it's blue or green, but you guys can see it. And I encourage you all to read it. And thank you for the pleasure of getting to moderate this.
Thank you, Anne.